Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Raj Persaud. I'm a consultant psychiatrist based in private practice in London, in Harley Street in London. Now, one of the many reasons people come to see me is basically because they're unhappy. And I'm going to be talking to Sarah, who is part of the School of Life, and she is involved in this fantastic book published by the School of Life called A Simpler Life. And this apparently is the secret to happiness. So, Sarah, let me start by asking you to tell us a little bit about yourself and your involvement with the School of Life. Tell us a bit about yourself.
Sure. I am a researcher and a writer, and I've been working with the School of Life for almost a decade now, on and off, in various capacities. The School of Life is a global organization that helps people cultivate the skills and perspectives that they need to have greater resilience and wisdom, and even what we might call eudaimonia. So the sort of deep, kind of fulfilling aspect of life, which isn't quite happiness so much as it is meaning or purpose or contentment. And in addition to what I do with the School of Life, I'm a researcher at Oxford University looking at the intersection between psychology and politics. And I do a lot of other sort of related projects to all of that.
Right. So eudaimonia, I think, and you know more about this than I do, is a word that kind of dates back to Aristotle, an ancient Greek philosopher. And he's arguing about what is the purpose, ultimate purpose of life. And I think one of his arguments is the ultimate purpose of life is happiness. But he means happiness in a slightly deeper sense than simply, let's say, the warm rush you get from heroin coursing through your veins. Can you tell us a bit more about what this term eudaimonia means and why it differs from the kind of simple happiness that we might refer to as hedonism, which is the pleasure you get from a nice glass of wine or watching a movie or hanging out with a hot date?
Yeah, sure. Well, look, I really enjoy the phrase that is often used in ancient Greek literature, count no man happy until he is dead. And and I think, if you dig into that, one of the assumptions is that we don't really know whether we are satisfied with the lives that we've lived until we are able to look back at them within a certain context. And that's a much different calculus to whether, you're enjoying yourself temporarily with all of these admittedly enjoyable things you've mentioned: heroin, wine, hot people, etc. So similarly, at the School of Life, the things that we're pointing to and the questions we're trying to answer aren't just about how to have any sort of temporary pleasure, but how to feel, for example, on your deathbed, that you are relatively pleased with the direction of your life. And notably, this allows for a definition of a good life that is compatible with a lot more ambivalence and suffering, and fundamentally more open to the idea that there is going to be quite a lot of difficulty in life, and we might not always succeed, we might not always get what we want, but we can still have this kind of fulfillment if we, for example, live in accordance with the values that we've developed, if we have meaningful relationships with other people. So it's a vision of a good life that we think is both more realistic and also more attuned to the reality of human existence, which is very complicated and full of suffering in many cases.
Right. So there's already kind of a notion that we're talking about, which is the notion that happiness seems to be elusive for many people. And
Right.
I think Aristotle was interested in this problem, which is that we do a lot of things that we think are going to make us happy, and they may make us transiently happy, but afterwards, in the long run, we seem to end up dissatisfied. And this is an increasing problem because economic growth means that we are happier, have more choices. The internet happened, mobile phones happened. We have access to many more things than ever before. So we ought to be happier. Yet it seems to be the case that happiness is increasingly perhaps elusive. And this is, in a way, what this book, let me get it on camera, A Simpler Life, is about: the idea that actually we're traveling in the wrong direction, generally speaking, society, economic growth, what the internet's telling us the next movie to watch. And we need to be traveling almost in the opposite direction. Could you say a little bit, therefore, about what you mean by a simpler life, and about this idea, if you agree with me, that society, your argument is society is traveling in the wrong direction?
Yeah, I think a good way of putting this is that this is not necessarily a critique of what we should be doing with our, let's say, working lives, although that does come into play. It's certainly not an argument that we should have, let's say, less science or less technology necessarily. But it is the suggestion, as you point out, that given the pressures of economic growth in the way that our current economy is modeled, we've created cultural norms that tend to emphasize things like being ambitious as possible, achieving as much in outward worldly success as possible, having increasing levels of complexity in every area of our life. So, all the scheduled things you could possibly imagine, especially for certain kinds of people in London, and so on. And we think that this is essentially a case of almost cultural overshoot. This is a thesis that the School of Life actually puts out in many different ways. Similarly, we think people are too focused on the idea of success rather than failure, which is a different book. So we think there are areas where our current conditions, our economic conditions, for example, and other conditions too, have led us to be culturally too far in favor of certain ways of living that are actually making us very unhappy, and unhappy in both senses. So we know, of course, or rather people that read lots of psych studies like I do, that people are actually highly overwhelmed by the amount of choice they face in their life, that they don't get that much happier once they reach a certain level of income, that the sort of benefits of working very long hours are quickly diminished after a certain point, and so on. But we also know that if we think about happiness more as this eudaimonic form of happiness, which is about meaning and purpose and satisfaction with one's choices and values, that those things are also not necessarily increased the more that we complexify our individual lives. So you're right, there's a social critique, and there's also an individual suggestion that regardless of how society's functioning, we're going to have to sort of pull ourselves back from it to live a good life as an individual or a small group or something like that.
Okay, so the book begins with simpler relationships, right?
Yes.
And I felt this was quite interesting and quite apposite, because Facebook and the internet leads us down the pathway that we need to have lots of friends, and that
Right.
you should all be very active, looking and involved with each other. The successful life is a life where we have lots of friendships. And you're advocating something quite radical, which is have only a very small number of friends. And also, very interestingly, and very rarely is this written about, you talk about what the true nature of friendship should be. And actually, a lot of friendship seems to be, according to this book, not the kind of activity that's going to lead to enhanced happiness. So first of all, what do you mean by simpler relationships? And what is the purpose of friendship?
Great. Two small questions. No, but we're really interested in these big ones, right? So firstly, the sort of, I think, just checking the friendship first, right? What's the purpose of friendship? We put three things in the book that we think are especially essential. Kindness, and we mean this not in the trite sense of giving each other little treats, but in the sort of deep sense of being able to be charitable to other people, even when they're difficult, caring about them, thinking about their needs. Shared vulnerability, something which I have to say, as this is men's radio, men statistically find much harder. So the idea of being open about one's own uncertainties, fragilities, and failures in life. And understanding, which again has to do with the sort of scope of imagination that we give to other people, with our willingness to see them in many different lights, and to give them the kind of understanding ultimately that we tend to want others to give us. And we argue that if you have these three attributes in a relationship, a friendship, of course, also a familial or romantic relationship, then that's really what matters. It's not about the number of friends you have on Facebook. We're not very impressed by this. It's not about whether your friends are impressive in the real world. If you have these three qualities, you're very likely to have what's actually a valuable friendship. And so we're not saying that you should dump friends if they have these qualities, but we are suggesting that if you have some friends that are really more there for bragging, maybe they've got to go, because we have a very limited amount of hours in our life. And it turns out that the quality of our life, and this is also something borne out in research and statistics, not that we always use them in the book, but it is there in empirical literature as well. The quality of our life is primarily determined by the quality of the relationships that we have. They are the best predictor in many ways for our happiness and our well-being. And so we are essentially suggesting that people focus on relationships that have these three qualities. I'm sure you could adjust them to your own set of importance, but roughly these qualities, and ditch the rest of the time that we often spend sort of showing off to people at parties and doing other slightly nonsensical things.
Okay, so we've got to find, though, these other people
yeah, that's
who are going to share this value system you're referring to. And that seems to be right away one of the problems, it seems to me, that what we do find is our friends are frequently wanting, which is that when they want us to turn up to stuff, when we turn up to stuff and so on, then the friendship's working. When we are in need, they often aren't available to us. So the problem with this analysis, in my opinion, is while I agree with it, you've got to find a group of other people who understand and share this value system. So I like the idea that we have too many friends because we haven't understood the true purpose of friendship. And that is a basic theme of the book, isn't it? We have too much of everything because we're not thinking hard enough about what is the true purpose of anything. We have too many books that we read because we're not thinking about what is the true purpose of reading. Do less of everything is what your argument seems to be. Have fewer of everything, but take it more seriously. So what's interesting is, for example, I expected you to be anti-materialist in the book, but in fact, you're not anti-materialism. You're saying have possessions, but have them in a sense that you truly value and treasure them. And if you have too many possessions, then you don't really care for each individual possession. Could you say something about that?
Yeah, about this idea that we should value a few things highly rather than have loads and loads of them. I mean, I think you're really correct at the very beginning of this conversation to point to the economic system we live in, right? That's based on growth. It's filtered into all of our brains, into the way that we think about everything. And it's basically the logic of investment under a capitalist system, right? You put something in and you want way more to come out, and it's all about more. And the funny, sort of ironic, sad thing about the human brain is that that is more or less precisely the opposite of what tends to bring contentment, because we adjust hedonically. So we actually adjust once we hit a certain norm. We kind of learn to ignore it, and it no longer makes us happy. You'll probably notice this when you buy something and you're so excited about your new, I don't know, shoes, helmets, headphones, whatever. And then in a week, that's just part of your life, and it's just there, and it's not necessarily, at least a lot of the time, making you any happier. So our suggestion is that a few key things that we buy and really use and love and value because they bring intrinsic value almost to our lives, like let's say you absolutely love jazz music and you get the best speaker and you can finally listen to all the great jazz that you've always been thinking about. That has something that you're probably not going to hedonically adjust to as much because there's something really meaningful about your relationship to it. So we're not saying, okay, don't buy a speaker set, right? It's not a sort of sparse form of, I don't know, Christian asceticism or something. But we are saying that most of the time, when we think in this logic of more and more and more is better, we actually lose out because of the psychology of how the human mind functions. And it also encourages us not to really focus, not to think through which things, because we're just thinking about more. So it's a lack of intentionality that's generated as well.
Okay, so more of everything. We live in a system which is encouraging us because the economy is based on economic activity. So we're encouraged to be active and do more. And for example, your anti-busyness. You give a wonderful pastiche account of a busy person doing a lot of busy things, culturally, not just commercially. And it's a lovely parody on busyness. So tell us a bit about the fact we're too busy and that sense of more activity leading to unhappiness, and true happiness comes from actually a simpler life in the sense of being less busy.
Yeah, I think what's really important to notice is that, and I'm sure this is different in different parts of the world, but certainly where I am in London, when you meet up with people, they always tell you, oh, I'm so busy. And they're sort of saying it to suggest that they're unhappy with the fact that they're busy, but they're also sort of bragging. And I think it's fair to say that, at least in the cultural context that I live in and that many sort of busy, professionalized people live in, you're kind of expected to be busy. And it would be a bit awkward if you said, actually, I've been really lazy lately and I'm loving it. Firstly, of course, we don't feel comfortable saying this at work. That's not what's expected of good employees generally. But even in our personal lives, we might find that this is something that's looked down on. At the School of Life, we point to things like the Protestant work ethic, for example, which is deeply ingrained in capitalist culture, as one of the things that's pushing people to be constantly sort of seeming as though they're working really hard and getting lots of interesting things done, and they're so overwhelmed, but it's good, actually. It's morally good. And we're trying to challenge this idea, not only that you should be busy, but that there's anything virtuous at all about filling up your day with lots of things. And so we encourage people throughout the book to say no to things, to work less if they can, and so on, because basically we think this is a bad value system that's designed to make people unhappy.
You're also saying if people are less busy, what are they going to do instead of the busyness? And one of the things is think. You talk about thinking, yes. And you also talk about appreciating what's around you. And you believe that these are very important things, that these are the true sources of happiness, as some other things as well. But let's talk about thinking.
Yeah.
and appreciating what's around you.
Right. I mean, I think, look, one thing to say is, maybe there's still a slight anti-intellectualism, to put it mildly, in our culture as a whole. If you look at the people that most people know and recognize the faces of, they're not necessarily intellectuals. And I don't mean this in a completely elitist fashion. I just mean they're not people that are fundamentally interested in ideas. Our children tend to know the names and faces of football players before they do interesting scientists or philosophers or whatever it is. And I think it's really important that we try to resurrect culturally the value of thought. Now, I think we could make it more accessible. I think we need to think about how inaccessible certain kinds of university-generated thought is. But one of our arguments in this book is that because we don't value thinking enough, we can continue to push on this busyness. Yet, if we're busy, we're really busy in the sense that we usually mean it. If we're running around, lots of appointments, a million people to see, lots of sort of obligations to fill, we're unlikely to be engaged in this sort of long-term, reflective, thoughtful, detailed, well-read, well-interviewed, etc., thinking that actually leads to a better sense of how we might want to live our lives and treat other people. So we think there's something about rest or apparent rest that allows for this kind of thinking, and we want to press on that.
So one of the things you talk about in the book is the notion that we wake up at 3 a.m. terrified that we're going to lose everything, that we're going to be sacked from work, our friends will ostracize us, and basically the ultimate horror is we end up living in a hut in the middle of nowhere because that's all that we can afford. We're banished, exiled from society. Then you give a lovely story of a man who really was kind of exiled into a hut.
I love this story. I love this story.
And you can tell you tell us the story. But anyway, so he ends up and you describe in graphic detail the poverty of the man. And then you describe how he achieves happiness in the hut. And the hut embodies our worst fears, which is everything collapses and we are left with nothing. Kind of really what we're left with is just ourselves, right? And that's the ultimate horror. And you're saying that we shouldn't be afraid of the hut, but the hut is the nightmare that we all face. We should not be frightened of the hut, and we should embrace the idea of the hut. So tell us what the hut symbolizes.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, obviously, it's not that we're literally recommending poverty to people. There's enough of that, the crisis of that happening in this country at the moment. But what we are saying is that in this particular story, which is about someone within the, I believe, Zen Buddhist tradition, the man sort of falls into this complicated spectacle of bourgeois banishment because this is a real historical example, because he's, I think, perhaps sort of failed to pay some debts and so on. And he ends up living in a hut. And he's not starving, to be clear. He's not, freezing or anything like this. He's just living in a very, very basic set of conditions in nature. And then he wrote this beautiful book about why that was, in fact, moving and meaningful and reorienting for him. And so our point here is that, as you say, once you're in the hut, once you have very, very little else that you're worrying about, when you're not worrying about, let's say, paying the bills so much anymore, you're left with yourself. And you're also left with something you pointed to earlier, which is the possibility of appreciation for very simple things that are very difficult to lose, like the sunset and, the beauty of the drops of rain on a leaf at 3 p.m. And our suggestion isn't that these are the only pleasures in life, but that at the moment we're no longer positioned to really see them, to see what's really happening in our life before it passes us by, as it will inevitably do for all of us. So the hut, in a way, is the symbol of the kind of simplicity that we're advocating, not because we think literally all of you should go live in huts in the woods, but because we think that the kind of comfort with one's own imperfect self and the attention to life as it's actually happening around you is what we need to cultivate, even if we still have to live in a sort of, masonette in London or whatever.
So the other thing that's very interesting, and I do think that people hearing about this may think this is a very simple analysis for the simpler life, but I actually am very impressed with the sophistication of the analysis, because you start off with the story of the Rockefellers and how basically the Rockefellers made a lot of money and therefore ended up building this incredibly ornate mansion to live in. And you talk about the fact that in a poor society where simplicity is the only option because people haven't got money, then by definition, when they have the ability to have money, when they have the ability to buy stuff, they will go for complexity and ornateness and show off their money. But today, when we have ornateness and complexity, what we crave is simplicity. So the other point I think you're trying to make is not just that you're advocating simplicity. You think deep down we actually want it, but we're finding it difficult to escape from the busyness and the complexity into simplicity. Could you say something about that? That actually deep down it's what we want, but we just can't be honest with ourselves in some sense.
Right. Yeah, I think this is really important. One of the things that we often do when we're teaching at the School of Life, because we have interactive workshops in classes, is we'll sometimes just put up very simple aesthetics, like extremely minimalist, beautiful spaces, just a couch and one table and a little pot of tea. And you can see all of the busy professionals in the room kind of look at this and they go, oh, and it's something that they want, right? And I think the Rockefeller example is similar. The original Rockefellers built these enormously ornate, sort of hyper maximalist, Gilded Age things. And then you get to the modern Rockefellers, they're literal descendants, and they're building basically the kind of minimalist houses I'm describing. It's not too big, doesn't have that much in it. And the idea is that we often seek in the aesthetics that we go for things that are missing in our internal life. Right. So if you're living in a time of extreme scarcity where most people don't have enough, then actually it's very aesthetically pleasing to generate an environment that is the antidote to that anxiety. But now our source of anxiety is that there's far too much going on. And actually we have what we need fundamentally to survive, but we are, at least a large category of humans in our society, are absolutely psychologically overwhelmed by it, and we crave this kind of simplicity. And so you're right, we're pointing to the idea that given the pressures of the world that we live in, we feel constantly like we need to earn more money and show it off in various ways and have as many Facebook friends as possible because we're terrified of all the essentially implicit threats in our existing social order. The fact that in theory we can be fired at any time and then we will lose all of these things, and that social status is assigned to that. But underneath, we also know that we need something like this psychological simplicity and the many fruits that it gives.
But given that there's a cultural imperative to be busy, to show off about how much you're earning, to have stuff that impresses other people, to go to parties. There's a lovely bit in the book where you describe the hell that is parties, and so on and so forth. What you're also saying is if you can embrace the simpler life in the modern Western capitalist society, you're going to be going a different route. You're going to be going an unusual route, right? And you're kind of saying you're going to have to be able, and you describe this as aristocratic thinking, which is a quite interesting use of the word aristocratic.
Yeah, some people don't love that phrase.
Yeah, but anyway, you're basically saying you're going to have to go your own way. You're going to swim against the tide. You're going to swim against the crowd. Everyone else is going to have lots of friends. They're going to be going to parties. You're going to have a small number of friends. You're not going to be showing off about stuff. And you're going to be brutally honest quite a lot of time in conversation in a way that is not seen as entirely the socially acceptable thing to do. So let's just stay with that idea that you're going to have to be comfortable doing what other people don't agree with or don't approve of. And I think there's a very nice idea in the book that we always buy on Amazon, the thing that's got 5-star reviews, or watch things. And you're asking a question, why are we doing that? Why, just because 1,000 people gave something 5 stars, does that mean you are going to like this particular thing? Why are you not allowed your own particular preferences and go your own route? And interesting you should say that, because I sometimes actually go for things that have a 2-star review just to see what it's like.
Right.
I mean,
how bad is it really?
Yeah, exactly. And actually, some of the times I saw a film that had 3.5 stars, and normally I would not normally watch it, and it wasn't that bad actually, and I could understand why I had to. But anyway, listen, let's go back to the point. You're saying you're going to have to swim against the tide, okay? You're going to have to be an individualist, and now that's difficult for most people, isn't it? I mean, there's a natural human tendency to want to be part of the crowd, and you're advocating, this is the bit that's going to be most difficult, isn't it, for most people? You're advocating to be comfortable with being different. Now, I know this has an ancient philosophical position. If you go back to Socrates, he wasn't afraid to be different. But Nietzsche, of course, perhaps the most famous, you know more about this than I do, modern incarnation of the idea that to run with the crowd, you're wasting your life, basically. The true life, I mean, Nietzsche, I think, famously said, again, you know more about this than I do, see your life as a work of art. And I think what he meant by that was be original. Whatever you do, be original, be different. Okay. So what are your thoughts about the idea that most people are going to find that bit very, very difficult?
Right. So to be clear, there are many versions of individualism. Some of them may be a little bit more toxic than others. But the one that we're advocating for here is that if we start with the premise that many of the things that are pressures in our existing world are not actually good for us, and we need to simplify, to use the word we use throughout the book, by examining them and rejecting them when they're not actually going to make us fulfilled in the long run, then you're probably going to end up doing things very differently from people around you. And as you say, this is really painful. And I would say this also comes from our experience of working with people. We have a big team of therapists at the School of Life, that a lot of the time, the logical consequence of being honest, first with oneself and then with other people about what one really values in order to do this process of simplification, is that you end up choosing something that's very different from other people. And we know this is incredibly painful to people. You can register it in an MRI machine, right? That just worrying about the social disapproval of others causes what is rather like physical discomfort in our brains, which makes sense as a sort of evolutionary survival story about the fact that we are social animals. And so one of the things that we're preparing people to do in this book is accept up front that it is painful to no longer do what is pleasing or obviously commendable to other human beings. That we have to sort of be prepared for that moment of discomfort if we want to reap the long-term consequences of living a life that is based on our honest assessment of what is going to be best for us. And I think it's worth saying, we're not pretending that this sort of simpler life is just easy. It's actually very difficult, because you're going to repeatedly have to let people down who think that really you should take the higher paying job, you should move somewhere more exciting, you should have 6 more friends, why haven't you come to the party, etc., etc. It's tricky. It's painful.
Okay. And the other thing that's interesting, because when you start talking about simpler life, what I like about this book is you go into unexpected areas. Mm-hmm. You talk about centrism, which is that to be a proper human being, you ought to be living in the center of major cities. And that means that you're enjoying the theater and the cultural experiences. And to be a hick and live in the middle of nowhere, what's wrong with you? You're missing out on life. And you give a lovely example of Jean-Paul Sartre's Simone de Beauvoir photographed in a French cafe, which I think has become extremely fashionable because Jean-Paul Sartre, famous French existential philosopher, Simone de Beauvoir, one of the most famous French philosophers, sat and had coffee there. But the reality was they didn't choose it because it was particularly special. They just chose it because it was cheap.
Right.
and now it's a famous place as a result. So you also attack centrism, the notion that we've got to be somewhere where everyone else is as well. Right. And that the house prices in central London as a result, the crowdedness of having to be where everyone else is, and the idea that if you're somewhere where no one else is, that you're missing out on life. Could you say a bit about centrism as well?
Yeah. Obviously, we're not referring to a political position, but we're referring to the idea that, another way of thinking about this is the classic FOMO phrase, fear of missing out. And the implication is that real life is happening somewhere else, presumably where people are doing something extremely cool and chic. And, it's been different. We always joke it's been in different cities depending on the year. So for a while it was San Francisco, and now it's, it was Berlin, but probably not anymore. Maybe it's some very niche place now. There was a whole time during COVID where it was like tropical islands of sort of refugee hipsters and so on and so forth. But our point is that life is happening where you are. And that there isn't necessarily some other more real, more fundamentally interesting place, that we should be suspicious of glamour as it's presented to us, because it distracts us from what we actually need to be engaging in, which is some of the very basic things, for example, involved in kindness. So, in friendship, things like kindness and understanding, as well as the sorts of things that don't have any glamour attached to them, but are probably very valuable, like taking care of an elderly relative. Our general point is that life is happening where you are, regardless of what other people are supposedly doing elsewhere. And that one of the things that prevents us from living this properly simplified life is our discomfort with throwing away what appears glamorous or central to go live in whatever kind of periphery, geographical or otherwise, we need to do what we're going to do.
Okay, so I feel that I've given you a fair crack of the whip in terms of defending the position. So now the gloves come off and I start to give you a slightly hard time over this argument. Okay, so the first point I would make is this monkish existence that you're advocating, and there's a nice example in the book about why monks tend to wear the same thing in terms of this sack-like piece of fashion that they wear, is that it takes away the idea they've got to make a decision every morning about what clothes to wear. It skates over some of the problems of the simple life. And one of the problems is when things go wrong, and you start needing help, like MRI brain scanners and vaccines and things like that, you are relying on a complex society, capitalistic society, to deliver these things that help us out. And if you really are living in a hut in the middle of nowhere and you wake up one morning coughing up blood, you're in trouble in terms of the 10-mile walk to the nearest clinic, etc., etc., etc. They are benefits to living in a complex society, and to live in a complex society does require a bit of money, etc., etc. There is a slightly rose-tinted view of total simplicity. Now, I know that we were having a chat before, and you were saying that's a straw man argument, because you're not saying you have to have total simplicity. What you're saying is just make your life simpler, right, and focus a bit more on some stuff, not everything. Okay, so I understand to some extent what your riposte is going to be, but is it not the case that it's better to live in central London than in the middle of some remote South Pacific island? Because if something goes wrong, that you break a leg or something, you will be saved, or you start coughing up blood, you will be saved in central London, but you won't be in a South Pacific island. There's a tendency to skate over the practical difficulties of the simple life.
I mean, look, I think it's really important to emphasize that the stories that we give as examples are not literal descriptions of how it is to live a simpler life, right? We're not saying that everyone should go live in a hut in the woods because, look where I live. I still live in London. I love it. But we're saying that the aspects, the sort of cultural pressures that make many of us live in cities like this are precisely the same kind of pressures that are likely to distract us from doing what really matters. For example, keeping us on a career ladder that actually isn't meaningful to us, going to visit loads of friends we don't really care about instead of investing in a few friendships. And I think once we understand that this is a metaphor rather than a literal analysis of where we should be, that it is possible to live the simple life even if you happen to live in, Highbury and Islington, then we can begin to examine each choice individually as right or wrong for us. It also doesn't preclude, let's say, technological advancement, right? I think, for example, developing a vaccine is a very meaningful thing. Someone who has successfully developed a vaccine can basically be said to almost inherently have lived a eudaimonically fulfilled life because they've done something that's beautiful and interesting and helps people and so on. So you can imagine a simpler life where that person is still doing extremely complex science. But from the perspective of how they've divided their attention, how they've managed their emotions, they are still living a simpler life. I think it's quite complicated. Go on.
Okay, the gloves come off again now in the politics of the situation. So we have had societies before that have tried to embrace what you're arguing, a more communal society, a simpler society, and of course at an extreme end we may call that communism, for example. And over again what we see is the capitalistic society with the greasy pole is the one that produces the vaccines. It's the one that produces the MRI scanners. In other words, it's the desire of people to advance themselves and perhaps to be greedy and to be too busy that tends to have cultural products. Whereas the societies where people go and live in a commune in the middle of nowhere, they tend to fail ultimately. So again, am I being unfair with that analysis?
Well, look, there are lots of ways of arguing about whether communism or something better than the previous forms of communism that have existed is possible. And I think probably you don't want to spend the next half hour talking about it. But this is what I would say as somebody who studies at a high academic, elitist level, the history of ideas and the history of politics. And that is to say that, to be honest, we have no idea because most of human history happened before either of these experiments was really happening. If we think about capitalism as not just having a market or something like this, but having, very vast amounts of wealth accumulated at the very top and reinvested in the system of production by private ownership, that's a very new experiment, really. Before that, we had other systems like feudalism, which maybe also weren't so great. And before that, other more primitive forms of economy. And it's true, there have been some experiments with communism, and many of them have ended up with gulags, and that's distressing. But the honest answer is, I don't think 300 to 500 years that we've been trying each of these forms is very long. And I don't think it's an exhaustive, at least in a certain sense, set of options that we've tried. And so I think the important thing really is not to be absolutely fixated on how we will solve the problems that these two systems have created, but what we really want to achieve in the long run, and then trying many things throughout the course of history. I mean, even Marx always had this beautiful phrase, right? He said, there's no point in writing the cookbooks of the future. We can't determine in advance which things are going to work. And I think this is absolutely true about capitalism as well. We know that capitalism, for example, is enormously destructive to the environment, and it may well literally cause the end of humanity if we don't do something more wise and also technologically advanced than we're doing now, but especially wise. So our argument is literally, of course, not for either communism or capitalism. We're making a almost argument that's prior to that about the set of values that human beings need to live by in order to even begin to think about what they would want, for example, politically. But I would say that I think it's important not to rush to conclusions after a mere 500 years or so about what our economic system should look like, because actually those are always historically contingent decisions anyway, based on the technologies we have available to us, what we've already tried, what our cultural values are, and so on.
Okay, now another argument against your position, because you give a very eloquent argument in the book about having simpler conversations in the sense of more honesty. We want
Yes.
people just to be themselves. And you give a lovely account of the classic date, because we live in a dating culture and people are interacting with each other on Twitter, on Tinder and dating apps, and things seem to be going wrong because I meet many people. Luckily, I'm happily married, but I meet many people dating, and despite all the advances in technology, it's not proving to be a very satisfying experience for many people. And you describe you capture it beautifully in the book about how people go on a date and they're basically thinking very hard of what's the right thing to say to be attractive. So someone on the date says, I love the opera, and you hate the opera, but you go, yes, I love the opera too, etc., etc., etc. So there's a kind of dance, and it becomes a very complicated dance, as your argument, in normal human conversation, because we're constantly trying to second guess what is the correct thing to say to stay in the game, to stay in the conversation, and to be liked. And as we build this complexity of saying increasingly stuff that is far away from what we really feel, we end up, putting it in a trite way, leading an inauthentic life, having inauthentic relationships, etc., etc. So you're advocating, let's just be honest in conversation, okay? Someone says, I like opera, you go, I can't stand opera. Okay, let's be brutally honest. And you believe, okay, that a lot of dates are going to end early, but you still think that's better. Okay, now I'm going to attack that argument by saying, after I've had a crappy day at the office, and I come home and my wife says, how was your day at the office, darling? If I say every single day I've had a crappy day, darling, it was a crappy day, the marriage won't last long. There is a sense in which human relationships require, to some extent, a certain veneer. Now, I agree with you. There may be too much veneer in a lot of relationships, but I'm warning you against the notion that brutal honesty is always the answer. There has to be a sense in which the self, that's a social self, in order to engage in conversation, there has to be an element of theater, an element. I agree with your point that there's too much play acting, but I don't agree with the point that the answer is brutal honesty necessarily. Anyway, what's your response to that?
I mean, look, I think it's interesting that we have such a common phrase as brutal honesty, right? Firstly, I think it's worth pointing out that the idea that just because we're honest, it's going to be painful is probably, something about our current culture and its anxieties. And actually, if you look at, for example, our other articles and so on at the School of Life's website, which is free and has lots of interesting articles and videos, we do talk about the sort of acceptable lies, let's say, right? For example, as you point out, maybe sometimes your wife doesn't want to hear any more whinging, and you're going to say, "Oh, actually, it was a nice drive home," or whatever, and you're sort of it's a lie by omission or whatever. Similarly, we would always say that there are ways of lying that are about telling the overall big picture truth. So if your aunt, who's quietly, losing her mind because she's very old, asks you if the cake she made is delicious, the emotional honesty in that situation is about your care and concern for her and your relationship with her. And you say, oh, the cake is delicious. And the cake is disgusting because she's completely forgotten where anything is in her house. But it doesn't matter because the big picture truth is that you love your aunt, right? But yeah, I think as with so many things in this book, we're looking for sort of cultural course correction. And I have to say that, this book was written by a team of us at the School of Life. I'm just the one on the radio show, but I am probably the most American person on that team. And when I came to Britain, I have to say, it was absolutely baffling and exhausting every single day. And honestly, it's only gotten a little bit easier over time because British people in particular say so little of what they really mean. And they have these very polite euphemisms. I think if you grow up here and you know the class system very well, you can sort of parse between the lines and figure out when someone dislikes you or hates your work. But it's rather challenging. And I also think that there is even more than this, and this I can't lay only at the feet of Brits, but on all of us, this absolute terror that if we tell people how we really are, they're not going to like us. And so one of the things that we really want to challenge here is that actually we are capable of being liked and loved, or else just put up with occasionally, in the way that we really are, right? That means grumpy, imperfect, not liking everything, not trying to please the other person, just as we are. And once we establish that kind of relationship with someone else, that's when we can have these key aspects of what we call, of what we deem the most important types of friendship.
Yes. Now, I still want to take issue with you here.
Okay.
I'm not unsympathetic to the idea that more honesty in our relationships and in our basic conversation would be helpful. I agree with you that we're scared of being honest, and more honesty would be helpful. However, what I think you're not quite seeing is when you first meet someone on a date,
yes,
and you're interested in the relationship going on a bit longer because they look interesting and exciting. Mm-hmm. It's at that moment that you're going to be playing a bit of a game about the whole opera thing, about whether you like opera or don't like opera. Now, 3 dates down the line, 4 dates, when it's clear you've made it to a 5th date, right? Then you can reveal you can't stand opera. So all I'm saying is it's kind of like a timing thing. And there is see, what I would argue is your philosophy is what we would call in my trade a romantic philosophy. And the romantic philosophy is just be ourselves and it'll all be fine. And
that's very interesting, because we actually hate romanticism very much at the School of Life.
But I'm referring to romantic in a certain sense, right? In terms of love. The romantic philosophy is the idea that we can just be ourselves, and as in all romantic Hollywood films, the perfect partner seems to fall into our lap. The more pragmatic scientific view is that what we need to do is be a little bit different to our normal selves, i.e. not your pure self to begin with. You can't be completely different from yourself because you can't keep that act up forever. But if you're an exaggeration of an ideal form of yourself, you'll get the date going. In other words, the argument is there are different phases in a relationship. There's the initial phase when you first see someone drop dead gorgeous in a bar, which is the attention phase. Then there's the interest phase, which is you go and talk to that person. And then that phase can last a few days or weeks. And then finally, there's the maintenance phase where you've decided to commit in some sense. And all we're arguing at the scientific, pragmatic, perhaps Machiavellian or manipulative view of relationships is just know what phase you're in, because there's a different role to be played. I believe your authenticity argument runs directly against that position. And what I'm saying is, yes, you do need brutal honesty, but you don't need it in the first few sentences of a date.
Well, look, I think there's an extreme on both ends to be had. But actually, I would challenge us to think about the pragmatism of it differently, right? There's always it's always good to, when you are told this isn't pragmatic, well, look at that really closely. And what I would say is, we're not saying, immediately say, well, look, Dr. Raj, actually the haircut is terrible, you should get a different one. We're not saying to just be unnecessarily abrasive and negative about anything you can spot. What we're saying is that even on the first date, in a way, you're kind of trialing out the idea of being in a relationship, right? And part of being in a relationship is being okay with a certain level of disagreement, which, if you think about it, is kind of also what we were saying about our lives in general, that if we are going to live this simpler life, we're going to do things that other people find weird or challenging or different or a bit annoying, or they constantly want to ask you questions about because they don't really understand it. And if you can model some level of that from the start of your interactions with somebody, then in a way it invites them into a different mode of engaging, right? So I again wouldn't tell you, okay, just trash your date's opinions right away. That's not good advice, or indeed necessarily being a very nice person. But I do think it can be fruitful to model the idea of oh, that's really interesting. I don't really like that, but it's nice that you do, right? To model this idea of difference and even differentiation from people that you otherwise like. Because then you can carry it through the whole relationship, even as you hopefully become only painfully honest later on, let's say.
Okay, so you're arguing for fewer friends, you're arguing for more honesty, you're arguing for simpler relationships, you're arguing for giving more time to relationships, but you're also arguing that time is one of the most valuable things. Give more time to yourself, create time. right? Let's talk a bit about that. And again, I want to challenge you. Although I am not unsympathetic to your philosophy, one of the problems you're going to run into is you're running against the zeitgeist in terms of the marketing culture. The whole industry around you is invested in selling stuff to people. That means if it can get people to own 3 cars instead of 2 cars, or be on the television for 8 hours rather than 2 hours, there's a big marketing push. There is no marketing push for going for a walk, because no one can flog you anything or has any vested interest in going for a walk. So all these simple things that are free, right, that you're arguing for in the book. And I'm not unsympathetic to the idea that going for a walk, enjoying a sunset is a great idea, right? The problem you've got is there's no one marketing it other than you guys.
Well, yeah. What about us?
And so you're running against the stream in terms of, I'm not, I suppose what I'm trying to say is you're idealists, which is charming, but naive, because you will win some converts. Don't get me wrong. And I'm not trying to dissuade you from your project, because as I said, I'm sympathetic to it. And I think there's some deep truths in here. But what I'm trying to say is you're running against the whole culture, because the whole culture has power. It's a Marxist point, really. Money is behind flogging stuff to people. If you're going to flog stuff to people, you've got to get them interested. And if you're going to get them interested, they're going to be on Twitter, on Facebook, reading the reviews on Amazon, blah, blah, blah. And you're trying to get people to move away from all of that. But there's no money in it. There's no money in your philosophy. And
no, I hear
there's no money in enjoying a sunset, because no one can flog you anything. So anyway, what are your thoughts about that argument?
I like how we're simultaneously sort of like Marxist and also maybe sort of, too idealist. And anyway, but look, I actually think, I'm, as much as I'm here as a spokesperson for the School of Life, I also separately think that actually we're quite pragmatic as an organization. We just do things. It's a business. It makes money. It doesn't make vast amounts of money. It's not, it's a pragmatic project in the sense that we know that we are a small voice in a loud, noisy world. And we're never going to make zillions of dollars doing it, but we think we could make some people's lives better. And I agree. It's countercultural. Anything that's countercultural to a degree, at least at first, unless it becomes a sort of meme in the grand sense of a meme rather than a literal digital image, tends to be lost among the din for large groups of people, which is a shame. But we also think that because people have this inner longing in some ways for the kind of life that we're suggesting, that maybe some of these ideas can go somewhere. And I don't think it's completely idealist in the sense that I don't think it's impossible, right? What we're suggesting that you can achieve is not impossible. We're not arguing, as some, rather schlocky self-help brands suggest, that you can have the perfect relationship, that you can have a totally unworried or unanxious mindset. Not at all. We think anxiety is with you for life. We think what we're suggesting is possible, if difficult. And that, it's true. It won't make anyone much money, except maybe occasionally a member of the School of Life's team. But even that, it will just make you happier, basically. And look, I agree with you in one sense. It is a dire battle to get people's attention if there's nothing funding you behind it. It's really difficult. But it doesn't make it any less meaningful. Remember, we're interested in living a meaningful life, and we think it's meaningful, even if we can only get a few people on board, with the idea of paying more attention to going on walks and less attention to, arguing with people on Twitter or earning the extra whatever a month.
Here's the paradox. There's some very interesting research, and I've written about this on the internet so people can find it, about the contrast between the meaningful life. The word happy there has a certain meaning we'll come back to in a second. And the research found that there were 2 kinds of people on the planet. Obviously, again, a bit of a trite statement. The people who were pursuing the meaningful life were often argumentative at dinner parties. If you made a statement that they didn't agree with, they would argue with you, right? And they were fighting problems they saw in the world. They saw pollution in the world. They saw environmental hazards. They saw injustice. And they didn't just go home and read a book and turn on TV. They did something about the problems they saw in the world. And therefore, they were engaging in a fight constantly with the injustice and the problems. So they were pursuing the meaningful life. But the meaningful life is you see problems in the world and you try to do something about it. And that's what you guys are trying to do in A Simpler Life. You notice this marketing push for increased busyness and complexity and a non-simple life, and you see that that's not going to lead to happiness. And instead of just, leading your own simple life in a hut, you're trying to do something about it.
That's right.
But the other people who are leading the happy life notice trouble around them, but avoid trouble. They don't engage with it. They notice injustice at work or the manager bullying another colleague, and they sit quietly. They just go home at 5, and they don't rock the boat. Okay, and
Right.
in a general sense, those people are happier on many measures of happiness. Now, I agree they're not leading the meaningful life. Okay. I accept that point. But you made the point right back at the beginning, in a way, and I'm paraphrasing what you said. The meaningful life, to some extent, does lead to suffering, but it's meaningful suffering as opposed to meaningless suffering. So again, what you're trying to say, which is not popular, is engage with difficulty. A lot of the stuff that you're advocating actually is difficult, right?
Yes.
It's easier to just go and read the 5-star review and do the 5-star thing on Amazon, whatever. So let's just talk about that, because really what you're saying is don't be afraid of difficulty, because we live in a culture which makes people scared of difficulty and not want to engage in it. By and large, if you're doing the difficult thing, you're doing the right thing. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's unfortunately not a neat enough rule that if we're doing the difficult thing, it's the right thing. That's obviously very complicated. But I think you're absolutely right. You've put your finger on something about what we're trying to say, which is that meaning and happiness in the conventional sense of the word happiness are not neatly aligned, but that our bet as an organization, so to speak, is that the meaningful life is the better one. And I would say that I also have found this to be true as somebody who, one of my main professional activities is called learning design. So it's looking at the psychology of how people learn, which, if you think about it deeply, is really like almost a philosophical question. What does it mean for someone not only to learn how to, I don't know, ride a bike or fill out a spreadsheet, but sort of develop into a totally new kind of human being at its grandest level, right? And what really strikes me about that process, what you learn from looking at lots of studies about this, is that if learning is too easy, people get bored. They're like, oh, I'm done with this. No, thank you. I mean, that's not true for absolutely everything. If you need to fix your dishwasher, you will be absolutely content with a very simple video that explains to you how to fix your dishwasher. But if it's a long-term project, like learning a new complicated idea or skill, people actually learn better. They become better at the thing, and they stick it out longer. They seem to enjoy it in some complex way a bit more when it's a certain level of difficulty. And I think this is the same kind of thing we're saying in a very different way when we're talking about life, right? None of us are big fans of suffering on its own. We're not like certain aspects of Catholic theology that think suffering is inherently good because it connects you to Jesus or something, you know. We're saying that there are many worthwhile things that require a bit of suffering to get there, if we look at suffering in a particular way. So they're going to mean that your parents are a bit disappointed that you didn't see your second great aunt, and they might judge your relationships or be unhappy that you didn't do this, and your friends are a bit annoyed that you didn't go to that birthday party of this person you don't know very well, and you didn't make that extra bit of money, and you had to sort of think about your budget for a while. But at the end of all of that, you will probably be able to live a more meaningful life in some other way. You might be able to be engaged in politics or social change in a way that matters. You might have a few good friendships with those people that you went on the long walk with, maybe, or even just with yourself, that are really valuable, and so on. So yes, we are essentially challenging people to think about the question of a better life in a different way. And we've used this word simpler, but it's a deceptive word. I mean, there is something simpler about what we're advocating, but it's also immensely more challenging and rewarding at the same time. That's what we're really going for here.
So we've been talking a bit about this book, A Simpler Life, and you've been part of the team that's produced it. It's produced by the School of Life. But you particularly have an interest in many things, other things, and you have an interest in polyamory. Could you just tell us a bit about that, if you don't mind?
Sure, why not? Everyone wants to hear about this. Well, look, I've written an article, which if you have any access to academic articles, you can read, with my co-author, Brian Watson. And we look at the lives, basically, and I think it vaguely connects to the book we just talked about, actually, in the sense that we've looked at the lives of people who in various ways were able to live as they really wanted to. So these are usually people that had a bit of money, though not always. They're key cultural figures that people know. They're people like Schrödinger, the physicist, Virginia Woolf. And we looked at what happened in their private lives, and what tended to happen is that they would have consensually multiple partners at the same time. So the formal academic jargon is like consensual non-monogamy, right? And we actually just did a study about what made this work well for them. And one of the things that we discovered is that usually there's a period of conflict at the beginning, right? This period of difficulty or suffering, where people are maybe having jealousy or conflict and not getting along. And then usually after around 2 or 3 years, sometimes a bit more. People settle into a routine, and they often live that way for the rest of their lives. So, for example, Max Weber, the famous sociologist who I mentioned earlier in this podcast, had both a wife and another partner. And even after he died, they lived together and died in each other's arms. So these are very long, complicated stories. But the real thing that we're emphasizing is that people who live this kind of unconventional life nevertheless appear to be relatively fulfilled and happy in it, which goes against a lot of the cultural norms that we're currently still experiencing, even hundreds of years later.
Yeah, but you're not referring, if I read you correctly, to the idea when you have people in lots of different relationships at the same time. So this is not the same thing.
We are, yes. So Max Weber would have, for example, his partner Else von Richthofen, who was a economist, and he was living with her and his wife.
Yes. They were, okay, but we're not talking about extramarital affairs. We're talking about
there's no lying involved generally.
Yes, right. We're talking about an open relationship where everyone knows what's going on, right?
Yes.
And often these people may have been living in the same house together, three or four people, or they may have lived separately, right? Yeah. But there's an openness. So the modern term, you use polyamory as a term, which might be a slightly technical term for many people, but the term they may recognize is an open relationship. Is that right? Where
look, all of these terms are sort of rough. Polyamory is a word that classicists hate because it's half Latin, half Greek, and it just means many loves. And that's why academics have ditched it, because they think consensual, whatever. Anyway. My understanding is that, at least in the world I live in, open relationships are usually more about sexual freedom, and polyamory is still usually more commonly used to refer to, long form, meaningful relationships emotionally over many years. And that's what we research primarily. So these are not people that just go off to have sex with other people and their spouse knows about it or something like that, but they're people who have very serious multiple relationships.
Yeah, but everyone involved in this, because I need to unpack this a little bit so that everyone understands what we're talking about, agrees to it. So it's not like someone says, is it okay if I take a lover? And the person who's being spoken to agrees to it grudgingly. Everyone agrees to it in a very open sense. They all want it. They're not choosing because it's second best to what they really want. Isn't that right? That's what you're referring to.
That's the idea. Now, I mean, I have to say, the study of history is messy, right? And I think it would be disingenuous to say, we've looked at all these people in history and none of them were doing any of this begrudgingly. It's impossible. I mean, firstly, we can't know everything. And secondly, probably I would say some of the people in this situation were less keen on it than others, but we're not looking at situations. We're not only looking at situations where that's happening. And in some of them, it's very clear that everyone is pleased with the situation. And there are some cases where it's more ambiguous. And what we're trying to highlight is that it's interesting to see how people eventually come to some quite satisfactory positions. Another good example is the guy who made the Wonder Woman comics and also invented the lie detector test had three serious partners basically his whole life. They lived in his house with him, and one of them raised all of the children and the other one got to be a lawyer, right? So there's this exchange as well of care. So most women couldn't be lawyers in the 1920s, never mind have children and be lawyers, but they made this work. And in this sense, at least, if not in many other senses, people are highly involved in negotiating something that works well for them.
But it's not just one man with many women. It's sometimes a woman with many men, right?
Or even a lot of the time it's queer. It is less common, right? Because that's how history works, basically. I mean, we're still existing in the patriarchy, so at least the examples that we have, there's a bit more of that. And I think it's good to be honest about that. These are not utopian visions on their own. They're just suggestions of how people can live their lives differently.
Yeah,
but we've got some queer people as well and so on.
The reason I'm bringing this up, this polyamory thing that you're interested in, is that it links back to the School of Life book, A Simpler Life, which is...
It does a little,
You're kind of saying, I mean, there's a sense in which maybe the whole idea of monogamy hasn't got a marketing push behind it in quite the same way as some of the other ideas we've been talking about. But
hasn't it got an enormous marketing push? Just think about every single movie that you ever see. I mean, I think that it's good to be suspicious about that one. I think it's got an enormous range. Look at the supermarket. Look at the images of the people in it. I mean, it's marketed everywhere. It's used to market too, right?
Yeah. All right. Okay. Yes. Yeah. Okay. But I'm not thinking there's someone plotting somewhere to sell monogamy to people because they're going to make money out of it in quite the same way that might be selling. Because I understand the point you're making. More what I was trying to get at is it reflects back to the idea that we should question what it is that's meant to deliver happiness. So we accept the idea that monogamy is the route to happiness, and you're saying we should question that, and you're saying it may not be for everyone, and people should make their own decisions for themselves. So it goes back to the notion of people swimming against the tide a little bit and deciding for themselves where happiness lies. I feel there's a tie in there back to the school of life.
I agree. This is the link in many of my areas of work. I'm really interested in how people can live lives that are actually about what will be satisfying and honest, rather than what will be easy or, make someone somewhere on some app a lot of money. Yeah.
Okay, so we're running out of time a little bit. Just to run over what we've been talking about, The School of Life, A Simpler Life is the name of the book. And we've been talking to Sarah, who has been part of the team that produced this book. So many thanks indeed again, Sarah.
It was a delight.
And thanks for this wonderful book, which talks about simplicity in a wide variety of different ways. I want to point out that the book is not saying you have to do these things. It's throwing out the idea that you may want to entertain some of these possibilities.
Taste the ideas.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. And that actually a simpler life is available to all of us, but we need to be wary of what's being pushed at us by marketing all around us. Sarah, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks for such a thorough, thoughtful conversation.